Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese, and I'm back here with the third episode in my series reviewing the Vikings draft picks from 2025. So obviously the first two, which you can go see on the podcast feed, were Donovan Jackson and Ty Felton. And this one's going to be on Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, the Vikings' fifth round pick. I believe it was early fifth round. He was 139 overall. He's a defensive lineman out of Georgia, right? He played on the edge at Georgia. He played kind of down inside, just a variety of positions from him. And it was really nice to be able to see that flexibility, obviously, as the Vikings use players kind of in that way, right? So I mapped him all the way out at 7 technique, right, which is outside the tackle's shoulder. He played 5 technique, 4 eye. 5 technique and 4 eye are where I would say he played most commonly, right? So 5 technique is heads up on the tackle and 4 eyes on the inside shoulder, or at defensive tackle where he's playing, I guess 4 eye counts for a defensive tackle somewhat as well. It's certainly the way the Vikings use their defensive tackles. Like Jonathan Bullard would have been a 4 eye a ton last year. Jerry Tillery was 4 eye a ton last year. He also plays 3 technique, some 0 technique on late downs, right? That are pass rush downs, where he's rushing the passer. So he plays all over the line of scrimmage. I think that's something that the Vikings value in players, right? And if you look at his measurables, for some teams, he might come in as a tweener, right? He's 6'4", over 6'4", almost 6'5", but 276 pounds, right? With 33.5-inch arms. And that 276 pounds he wasn't really a dynamic rusher off the edge, right? He's not somebody you necessarily expect to beat tackles with speed at the NFL level, but at the same time, that's a bit light to play on the interior the entire time, right? So that kind of gets labeled as a tweener, where he doesn't necessarily have the pass rush potential to be a high level edge rusher, but he also doesn't have the size to play down to down on the inside, at least right now. Now he's got a big frame, right? So I think he can probably put on more weight if he wants to, but honestly, I think as a rotational piece, I like him kind of doing the in-between stuff on this defense, right? Have him out on the edge when you need a little bit more beef and run defense, and I'll get into everything he does in terms of run defense and in his pass rush game. And then on the inside, you can move him on the inside on later downs and kind of have him rush the passer from the interior, use his quickness and his explosive ability to get after the quarterback on the inside. Honestly, though, no matter how you slice it, he's a great athlete, right? If you look at the RAS testing, which, I have some gripes about how RAS looks at prospects in general, but for Ingram-Dawkins, because he did all of the testing, like he shows up really, really well, right? He's got great jumps. He jumped 36 inch in the vert, 10.04, 10 feet 4 inches in the broad jump. A 4.8 640 again is kind of where the tweener aspect comes in. That's slower than you'd want a top tier edge rusher these days. I think guys can get by with that speed on the edge, especially guys who are primarily run defenders, right? But I don't think that kind of burst and that kind of profile leads to somebody who you think can become a top tier edge rusher in the NFL. You just need a little bit more speed to be able to get around the edge, and a kind of an average 10-yard split as well, right? At 169. Really, you want to be in the low 1.6s for an edge rusher. Anything under 1.60 is like fantastic. But he has a good short shuttle for an edge rusher and a pretty good 3-cone as well at 7.29. Like that's a fine 3-cone, especially for someone who's 276, right? If it was someone who's 250, I'd be a lot more concerned about his flexibility and that sort of thing. If he's running a 7.28, I'd like to see guys who are 20 pounds lighter than Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins run in the 7-second range, right? But because Ingram-Dawkins has the additional size, I think that's a totally fine 3-cone, and the short shuttle of 4.34 is great for somebody who's 276 pounds, right? In the last episode, I talked about Ty Felton, and I kind of criticized his short shuttle, which ended up being somewhere in the 4.2s, right? He ran sorry, I'm pulling it up here. Yeah, he ran a 4.27. So Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins at, what is that, 90 pounds heavier than Ty Felton, ran less than a tenth of a second slower than Ty Felton did in the short shuttle, right? That flexibility and that movement skill, I think really shows up when you look at that kind of testing. And if you flip all of those numbers over from a defensive tackle size, right, on the RAS website, you can flip them back and forth. He is elite in pretty much every category. I mean, he's got like a 99.7th percentile broad jump, 99.3 percentile in the vertical, 95, 96 percentile 3-cone at that 7.28. Once you put him as a defensive tackle, 97th percentile short shuttle, right, and a 95th percentile 40-yard dash at the 4.86. Once you put all of that information into being an edge rusher, being an interior defensive lineman, a defensive tackle, right, listed as that. The only place where he falls short is on the weight, obviously, with 11th percentile weight at 276, right? So his quote unquote strength or something that benefits him in his RAS profile as an edge rusher, as a defensive end, starts to bring him down a little bit, but still he has a basically 98th percentile, right? 9.79 RAS if you list him as a defensive tackle. That's roughly 98th percentile, right? It's the first two numbers are your percentage, basically. When you look at the way RAS is scored on a scale from 0 to 10. So, at the end of the day, he's got a fantastic athletic profile for anything you want to do as either an edge rusher or a defensive tackle. So I think, honestly, I can see the use case for both things with him, and I think the Vikings probably plan to and should, in my opinion, use him both on the edge to help secure their run defense and on the interior to maybe add a little bit of pass rush in certain situations. So I'm gonna go through kind of my scouting and how I view him as a player after scouting him, and then we'll go through and talk a little bit more about what I see his role specifically being on the Vikings, kind of comparing to their current players and seeing where he fits. So, for Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, I'll start with run defense. I'll go into his pass rush, and then that's pretty much it for a defensive lineman, right? Like, obviously there's a lot of things that are in common. But I'm not quite breaking it down to the level that I did with the Ty Felton, where I talked about like his releases, then his route running, then catches, and that sort of thing. It's really just run defense and pass rush to me. It all kind of comes in as one package for the defensive line. So I think the first thing, run defense, I think Ingram-Dawkins plays at a really high level already. You really see the burst and explosion, right? Those incredible jump scores that he has kind of jumps off the tape as he gets off the snap. There was a play against Notre Dame, which was in the playoff. It was a game Georgia ended up losing, but it was a really tightly contested game. And I think Carson Beck, Georgia's quarterback, had gotten hurt, so they could basically do nothing on offense the entire game, which really led them to, kind of have to play as good defense as possible. And they held, Notre Dame to something like 20 points. Notre Dame's offense ran the ball a ton in this game. There are so many run defense reps from Ingram-Dawkins in this game. And I thought he really showed out well. Like, I thought he was pretty consistently winning against the opposing offensive line throughout the course of the game. But the first play I highlighted, and like my other two guys, I have an article out on Zone Coverage about Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, kind of going through the video and all of the stuff that I scouted with him, right? So the very first play I highlighted, he jumps off the ball, hits the opposing offensive lineman in the chest, and knocks him back multiple yards, right? So he's lined up as I guess it's a 7 technique, right? Where he's out on the edge on the outside shoulder of the tackle. He hits him in the chest, knocks him back multiple yards, right? So he's lined up outside the left tackle. The run call is to the right edge. He knocks the offensive lineman so far back that the offensive lineman runs into the quarterback who's running to his left, right? So he basically pushed the left tackle all the way to like the right guard's area because he got off the ball and underneath his pads with such explosion that he kind of knocked the left tackle into the quarterback. It's a really, really impressive play from Ingram-Dawkins, and it kind of showcases his power, his explosiveness off the snap. I really think that explosiveness off the snap shows up like particularly on the interior, but like on a regular basis against the run. He beats reach blocks from his opponents, right? So the opposing tackle is trying to reach him, right? So he's lined up at 3 technique. The left tackle is supposed to go to his right and or Ingram-Dawkins is left and reach Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, get around him to seal him off from making a play. And Ingram-Dawkins just denies that with a first step. I think he does it on a really, really consistent basis. So I'm really happy to see that explosiveness and that athleticism that I talked about show up on tape. Another thing about Ingram-Dawkins and run defense and just his explosive first step in general is his ability to do that while playing from a 4-point stance. So what I mean by a 4-point stance is he just has both feet, obviously, and both hands on the ground, as opposed to a 3-point stance where you have one hand on the ground and the other hand up on your hip, kind of in a sprinter stance, right? That sprinter stance allows you to get a little bit more explosion off the snap, whereas, the 4-point stance is kind of a more run defense. It allows you to prepare yourself a little bit better to take on contact from the opposing offensive lineman. He's able to get off out of that 4-point stance, get into gaps quickly, and I really think that shows off his explosive traits. He has another rep in the Notre Dame game where he's able to work laterally down the line of scrimmage and make a stop on a running back cutting back. That's an important trait for an edge rusher, right? You have to surf down the line of scrimmage, is what I'll call it, and be ready for any cutbacks that requires explosive ability. A lot of times you're unblocked in those circumstances, so you have to have the athleticism to actually get to the play because they're leaving you unblocked for a reason. They don't believe in your ability to chase down the back from the opposite side. So actually showing and displaying that ability is obviously another really positive sign. I think Ingram-Dawkins has a good anchor too, right? He's got long arms, so he's able to use those to get into the chest of his opponent, and control contact and not let opposing offensive linemen drive him off the ball. He consistently stonewalled the left tackle from Notre Dame. He consistently stopped pullers in his tracks. So as a edge rusher, if the opponent's pulling, usually what's going to happen is you're going to get tried to be kicked out by the opposing guard, right? We see Jonathan Grenard do a really good job of stopping this and squeezing the space that the running back has to be able to run. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins can do this really well too. And a lot of times Ingram-Dawkins played on the right side of the defense, the left side of the offensive line, right? So the offensive tackle in front of you, the left tackle, is going to down block, right? Go towards the defensive tackle, probably combo with the guard up to a linebacker behind you. And then the guard from the other side is going to come around and try to kick out the defensive end and, create space for the running back in between, that down block by the left tackle and where the guard's kicking out. Ingram-Dawkins is really able to stonewall that very well and prevent the puller from actually creating a lane, clogging up the rushing lane. There was another rep where I thought he used his power and then he uses his explosiveness, right? So he likes to use a swim move in the run game. So he got through the left tackle by, defeating his arm, swimming his other arm over the top, and then he had to take on a tight end block right after the left tackle as the left tackle tried to climb to the second level, but he knocked the tight end right back into the running lane and it kind of tripped the running back up, right? So you see him be able to deal with multiple threats in the run game and kind of process multiple things at the same time, which I think is a really, really nice way to do it. also, I talked about his ability to stand up opposing offensive linemen. He held up pretty well against double teams, especially for a player of his size. And this is going against strong competition, right? I watched the Clemson game. I watched the Notre Dame game. I watched I watched Kentucky, Auburn, and Texas, right? So, Texas was one of the best teams in the country. Clemson is consistently one of the best teams in the country. Notre Dame obviously made it to the championship game. Kentucky and Auburn are SEC schools. Like, they have quality talent on all of those rosters, and he was able to hold his own against the interior offensive linemen, right? Who are going to be big, powerful players. So I don't know. I just really like what I saw from Ingram-Dawkins generally as a run defender. So, he's able to hold up against double teams on the interior. There was a play where zero tech against Clemson. The center and guard tried to double team him, and he held his ground really well. He didn't get knocked back multiple steps. He's able to chop his feet as he loses ground. Anchoring as a defensive lineman is pretty similar to anchoring as an offensive lineman against a pass rush, right? I talked about Donovan Jackson's anchor in his episode. It's a similar thing from a defensive lineman, and he was able to do that on an okay basis. It wasn't like the most consistent thing. There was a rep where he got knocked back against Notre Dame. On that rep, though, he was running a stunt. So he was moving laterally and didn't have the time to prepare himself to be able to actually stand up and, prevent himself from being pushed back. So he got washed down the line of scrimmage. But again, those kind of reps where that happened were few and far between. So even though he's 270 pounds, right, I think he has the physical ability to anchor as a defensive tackle right now. Like, he's got the natural strength to be able to do that. It's not going to be consistent when you end up going up against better offensive linemen in the NFL, obviously, right? Like, even the guys who are good at Clemson and Notre Dame and that sort of thing aren't all NFL players necessarily. So there needs to be more progression in terms of his strength, and that probably comes with added weight, right, that he would have to add at the NFL level. So it does make him a little bit of a tweener, but it is a good thing to see him consistently able to play against those double teams as a baseline, right? It's like, if he had this tweener weight and wasn't able to play against double teams at the college level, that'd be a huge, huge concern, because he needs to add weight and get significantly stronger to play. But because he was able to relatively consistently hold up against double teams, even if it wasn't completely perfect, I think that you see the baseline strength is going to be there. And if he's able to add more weight, he can be even stronger and play on the interior better. But, as a baseline, he's extremely rugged on the edge as well, right? So it's not even that big of a concern if you need to, like, limit him to playing run defense on the edge, right? And kind of use him inside and have that first step quickness, which shows up in the run game, also translate to the passing game. There is one aspect of Ingram-Dawkins' game that I'm not thrilled with when it comes to run defense, and that comes with, like, he's great at taking on blocks, right? I've talked about his anchor. I've talked about his first step quickness to get by guys. I've talked about, his long arm to kind of control opponents' chests and stop pullers and things like that. But I don't think he sheds from blocks particularly well. There were a couple really nice reps of him shedding. There was one against Clemson where he completely threw the opposing offensive lineman to the ground. And then there was another one where he knocked the right tackle completely off of his path, right? So there were quite a few flashes, but I thought from a consistency perspective, he really struggled to do it. So when you're shedding blocks, that requires more advanced hand fighting than obviously anchoring, right? Which requires you to, if you're using a long arm, stick your arm into your opponent's chest and have a good base with footwork to anchor against that, or have two hands where you're doing a similar thing, trying to keep your pads low and just, on offense, you want to control your opponent's chest. It's kind of the same on defense as well. You want to control your opponent's chest and make sure that you're underneath him and he's not pushing you any further. But as the running back goes by you, even when you're anchoring, you now want to shed and dismiss your opponent's hands to try to get towards the running back, right? That's how you end up getting tackles in the run game. And Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins has a ton of missed tackles and had a really high missed tackle rate, I believe, if you look at his PFF stats. And I think that's because he's not able to shed consistently effectively. So he'll get like one arm out there that he's able to get on the running back and he can't bring him down, and the running back fights through that contact, where if he was able to shed and get both of his arms free, he probably ends up making the tackle, or he's still got a lineman, kind of on him and blocking him. So he really needs to develop his hands to come up with a way to start actually shedding those blocks, getting in front of the running back, and, making those plays. One last quick thing on run defense that I want to hit is his ability to show effort, right? There were a couple plays on tape where it was very clearly an effort play for him, where he finishes through the whistle. There was one where the running back got downfield. He did his job on the play, held his gap, probably set the edge against the right tackle, and the running back, ran up the middle, not in his gap at all, down past him. He turns around and accelerates down the field and is the one to end up making the tackle 10 to 15 yards down the field. That kind of effort where you're following through on plays, you're on the backside of the play and you try anyway, the running back ends up cutting back and you make the tackle. Or, he's already past you and you have to chase it downfield, or there's a screen play on the other side and you're chasing that downfield. It breaks for, 20 or 30 yards, but it's not a touchdown because you chased it down and you showed the effort to run it down. That effort to me is a prerequisite for players in the NFL, right? So I guess I don't know if it's worth points, right? But it's worth noting because the absence of that would be a concern. Or if you see plays where he's loafing and giving up and not finishing through the whistle on the rep, that becomes a concern for players, right? So definitely think he has the effort to do it, and think that overall Ingram-Dawkins is a really strong run defender. That anchor ability, that first step quickness, that explosive power that he has in his lower half, I think really are going to set him up for success defending the run in the NFL. But he still needs to develop his baseline skills in terms of the hand fighting aspect of the game, right? So he's got a good baseline. He's got great athleticism to do it. He's got great strength to do it. He needs to work on refining his hand technique to become a really good run defender at the NFL level, as opposed to somebody who can kind of just hold his own, right? And hold his gap and hold his responsibility. It doesn't matter if you're holding your responsibility if the running back's still able to run by you, right? Into the gap that you're in. So that is kind of the run defense. That's kind of my overall run defense take on Ingram-Dawkins. So we can flip it over to the pass rush side. And as a pass rusher, Ingram-Dawkins was not asked to be the primary weapon in the Georgia defense, right? Georgia had Jalen Walker. They had Mykel Williams. Both of those guys went in the first round. They had Chaz Chambliss, who the Vikings signed as the UDFA, who was more of a speed rusher, edge rush type, right? A guy going around, as opposed to Ingram-Dawkins is more 4-eye, dirty work pass rush role. They used him a lot on the interior as a pass rusher, right? Lined up at 1 technique. Over the guard, lined up at 3 technique, wind up at 5 technique with an edge rusher outside of him, the kind of the old Justin Smith role. If you remember those old 49ers teams with Justin and Alden Smith, they would have Justin Smith would basically do the dirty work, and Eldon Smith would run around and get the sack, and he got like 19 sacks one year because he was lined up on the same side as Justin Smith, and Justin Smith kind of let him get a free run at the quarterback all the time. Not to say Eldon Smith, wasn't a really good speed rusher in his own right, but having that combination, the dirty work player doesn't get the love, and that's what Justin Smith was doing. That's what Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins was kind of doing at Georgia, right? So I do think that, as a contain rusher, Ingram-Dawkins does a pretty good job. So I talked about, you're trying to occupy opposing offensive linemen. And there was a really nice play in the Texas game where he occupied his opposing offensive lineman, is just kind of pushing on the rep, keeping his eyes on the quarterback, Quinn Ewers, who ended up getting drafted. And, he's able to disengage from the opposing lineman and chase the quarterback down. Against mobile quarterbacks, which you face frequently in the NFL, having that contain is critically important, right? Because you're going to have one guy who's probably attacking the quarterback, trying to go around him, which means the quarterback likely is going to be able to step up between the tackles, and you need to have another player coming around underneath to be able to prevent him from just stepping up and running through the middle of the defense. This is the problem in the 2022 Vikings had against Daniel Jones in the playoffs, where they didn't do a good job containing, right? They didn't have rush discipline with or kind of nuance with how their pass rushes were designed, because Ed Donatel wasn't a good defensive coordinator. So they ended up allowing just all sorts of scramble lanes for Daniel Jones. The Vikings under Brian Flores have been one of the best quarterback scramble teams in the NFL because they're have really well thought out pass rush lanes. Probably the fact that they blitz all the time helps because it just limits the number of lanes that the quarterback has to run through, right? But you have to have disciplined contain players when they are running. And I thought Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins showcased that skill pretty well. So if we move on to like actual pass rush technique, right? Because containing is nice, but we're trying to get after the quarterback when we're rushing the passer, right? Like it's just kind of obvious. And I think that athletically, Ingram-Dawkins has a really good skill set, particularly for his size, right? I talked about the first step quickness earlier in the run game. That translates over to the pass game. You want, obviously, your pass rusher to have an explosive first step. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins has that. I also think there's lower half flexibility and ankle flexibility to turn the corner in certain scenarios. There were a few plays where I saw him get upfield on the outside shoulder of whoever was blocking him, whether that was a guard, tackle, tight end, whoever, get upfield, put his foot on the ground, and be able to flatten out at an angle towards the quarterback, creating a pressure or flushing that guy out of the pocket, right? There was a play in the run game. It was a pin and pull play, but I really think it shows the kind of flexibility that I wanted to see, where the tight end tries to pin him and absolutely cannot. And Ingram-Dawkins turns around upfield and chases the play. The running back's already by him. It was just kind of a matter of the design of the play, right? Where Ingram-Dawkins took his first step and how it was being blocked and where the run was to and that sort of thing. But he still showcased the flexibility to burst outside, where if that player now had to cut back again towards the inside, Ingram-Dawkins is there to make the play. I think that translates really well to going up against, as a pass rusher. When you inspect his sacks, right, he had 3 sacks on the year. He only had like 4 sacks for his entire college career. But 2 of them were against Auburn. And that Auburn tackle is listed at like 6'8", 350 pounds, and he's incredibly slow off the snap. Ingram-Dawkins just flashed and beat him inside. So, it's great to see the explosiveness from those plays, but it's not really, there wasn't really a lot of technique to be gleaned from him as a pass rusher. The third sack that he had was against Kentucky, and he used a spin move against the tight end. So it's probably a mistake to block this guy with tight ends. Obviously, he's a lot larger than tight ends at that 275, 276 or whatever it is range. He'll probably be even larger at the NFL level. And that makes it really difficult with his combination of explosiveness and size for a tight end to block him, right? Because if he's able to burst up field, the tight end needs to protect against that. And then he can use an inside counter like the spin move he used against Kentucky to get inside and get to the quarterback. So that was really good to see. I thought as a pressure generator, right, he used his quick first step, and then his hands against interior blockers were probably where he was at his best, right? So there were a couple reps against Clemson where he just beats the center on his first step. He clubs the center's arms away so he can use his hands as a pass rusher to dismiss the hands from the opponent, whether that's with a swim move or just a club rip, or that sort of thing. So, as a general hand usage, I think that Ingram-Dawkins flashes some technique, but I wouldn't say he's necessarily consistently good at, right? So, like, the things you want to see from an edge rusher are the ability to win upfield and kind of around the edge. I think the explosive first step from Ingram-Dawkins is a plus in that, and he has some bend, right, to be able to turn the corner. I don't know if that's going to be necessarily a go-to him at the NFL level, where you just have some quicker players, right, and guys who are better at setting at offensive tackle and kind of getting out there, right, and have just a more effective and wider and more elongated kick step, right, to be able to close off that space from Ingram-Dawkins. When guys do that, I do think he has an inside counter, right? He's not necessarily the most powerful player in the world. Or that's not what I meant. I meant he's not the most technically refined player in the world, right? So he's got the explosive first step. He's shown flashes of how to win with an inside counter, whether that's swimming over players or, that spin move that he used against Kentucky or getting his hands into their chest. But I think too often he lets the opponent get his hand into his chest first, right? So as a defensive lineman, as an offensive lineman, your goal is to set to where your opponent is rushing and then hit them in the chest with your punch, whether that's a one-hand punch with two hand, one hand first, the other hand second, a two-hand punch, whatever your technique for hitting that player, you want to get them in the chest and get control of their chest. Usually you're grabbing the jersey there, right? And they're going to try to knock your arms off of you. They're going to try to knock your arms down on the initial punch, which is what the best pass rushers are able to do, right? They're able to win that first contact or get their hands in their opponent's chest first, in the offensive lineman's chest first. Ingram-Dawkins doesn't do that. He lets his chest up to opposing tackles, and he really lets them control them, right? So there was an example against Clemson where he tried to use a swim move, right? But he didn't win and knock down his opponent's hands to get him off his chest first. So he just tries to swim over and he just gets pushed back by the opposing offensive tackle. The other thing I thought was pretty interesting for him as a pass rusher, I talked about, okay, he's got this explosive first step to threaten upfield. He shows counters coming back inside, but he doesn't show counters or what's called speed to power, where you have the first step upfield, your opponent is kind of on his heels trying to catch up with you, make sure you don't run around him, and then you just stick your hand in his chest and knock him back. So if he cuts off your path, a totally valid way to rush is just through your opponent into his chest, knocking him back towards the quarterback. This is the way Jared Verse wins, right? With the Rams, he's a pure power rusher where he's able to use his explosive first step and then convert that into power where he knocks his opponent back. I talked earlier about, one of the most exciting plays I had from Ingram-Dawkins, and the first play I talked about was him knocking an opposing left tackle into a quarterback running counter the other direction. He doesn't show that strength and that ability to knock your opponent backwards on a consistent basis as a pass rusher, and I really wish he would. So I really wish he'd convert into a bull rush. He just hasn't developed that part of his game. And I think it's something he's going to need to develop as time goes on. So as a little summary here, right? I really like where Ingram-Dawkins is at as a run defender. I think day one, you can put him on the NFL field and have him not get embarrassed as a run defender. His first step quickness is great. His anchor is great, right? So he's not going to get completely knocked around and leave wide open lanes. But what he needs to work on is disengaging from his opponent, right? As a pass rusher, it's a similar story. He shows the first step quickness. He shows some ability to win with his hands, but it's not consistent in terms of winning with his hands right now, right? He too often lets opposing offensive linemen get into his chest, completely control him on the rep. You don't see a ton of impact from him as a pass rusher because he's not winning with his hands, in the same way you don't see a ton of tackles from him as a run defender because he's not shedding and kind of winning with his hands in those scenarios. I really think he has the strength to become a better bull rusher than he currently is. I don't know why he doesn't use the bull rush as often as I think he probably should be, given his level of strength and the explosiveness that he has in his lower half. So I'd like to see that develop something. But you do have, a couple flashes of what could be, right? You see some really sharp inside moves after a bursty step up field. So that inside counter is something I want him to continue to develop at the NFL level to become a better player there. But overall, I really like the package from Ingram-Dawkins, right? I think you get a good run defender and somebody who can be impactful, who has the potential to be impactful against the pass, right? He has the potential to be a strong pass rusher, I think, with his athletic traits, and particularly on the interior. So I guess the role I would envision for Ingram-Dawkins with the Vikings initially would, to me, mirror Pat Jones from last year more than anybody else. So the Vikings used Pat Jones as a true edge rusher most of the time, right? And he was a little bit heavier, I think, in the 260 range, whereas Van Ginkel and Dallas Turner are obviously in the 240s, right? With Jonathan Grenard, I think, being listed somewhere in the 250s, but he's a more powerful player at edge. So if you want to put Jonathan Grenard and Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins and have more of a run defense package on early downs on the field at the same time, with Turner and Van Ginkel kind of off the field, who are both good run defenders in their own right, but they just don't have the bulk that someone like Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins does to hold up against a more sturdy run game, like against the Lions or somebody like that. The Vikings play the Eagles this year. Maybe that's something you want to look into. Or, obviously just to spell guys too, right? Because Pat Jones played a significant amount of snaps last year. We expect Dallas Turner to play more snaps, but Dallas Turner's 300 snaps go to Pat Jones's 500 or 600 snaps or whatever it was. I think it was in the 400s because he ended up getting hurt. And then you need somebody to fill in for 300 snaps on the edge, right? And the Vikings really don't have depth pieces. I mean, they have Bo Richter as a carryover from last year. They have Gabriel Murphy, who's a smaller player, right? And I think Bo Richter weighed in the 240s as well. And the Vikings really didn't add any outside free agents at the edge rusher position. So I really think as a base end who's a heavier player, Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins makes a lot of sense to get some playing time right away. And then you can reduce him down inside. A role I've talked about a fair amount was the Jihad Ward role last year, where Ward was ostensibly an edge rusher, but he played pretty much as a pure interior pass rusher on passing downs for the Vikings. To me, I wouldn't necessarily put Ingram-Dawkins in that role, although I think he can execute it okay, and I think his best path as a pass rusher at the NFL level is on the interior. But I think what I'd like to see is have Javon Hargrave in that kind of role, right? Sometimes maybe have Jonathan Allen spell Javon Hargrave in that kind of role. And then you have Ingram-Dawkins rotate in as an interior pass rusher, but not kind of the primary designated one, if that makes sense, right? Where Jihad Ward came in, he was the designated interior pass rusher, and then they'd put Van Ginkel, Turner, and Grenard there, and Grenard would be an interior rusher, or sometimes it was Van Ginkel, Jones, and Grenard, right? In addition to Ward, sometimes I'm sure you had Jones, Van Ginkel, Turner, but whichever way it worked, Jonathan Grenard and Jihad Ward were the people who reduced down inside pretty much in those circumstances. I would want it to be, a Javon Hargrave next to a Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, and you put Van Ginkel and Turner as the edge rushers, or Van Ginkel and Grenard, Turner and Grenard, whatever combo you want on the outside, and not have to have Jonathan Grenard do the dirty work on the interior, just because I think, he's more of a threat coming off the edge. So that can be the value of Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins as an interior pass rusher. So, like I said, I kind of see him fulfilling the Pat Jones role in the Vikings defense, which I think makes a lot of sense because the Vikings didn't add any resources this offseason besides Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins to do that. So I think it's kind of tailor-made for him and ready to go. But yeah, that's how I feel about Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins. I'm really excited about the pick from just his athletic potential with his solid floor as a run defender. I think make it for a really, really good bet in the 5th round of somebody you hope can develop to be a starting player. And I think that's something that Ingram-Dawkins can do. Like, I think he can play rotationally right away because of his run defense ability. And I think you hope that he then turns into kind of a dominant force, if you will, because he has all the athletic potential to do that, in my opinion. So with that, I'm going to end this episode. My name is Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football on BlueSky. You can find my co-host, Nick Olson, at Nick Olson NFL. You can find the podcast at Kindred Skulls on Twitter, also on BlueSky. We're available on Apple, Spotify, wherever you hear podcasts, also available on YouTube. And with that, Skull Vikings.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.